The coffee in the paper cup had gone cold an hour ago, but Hazel Briggs kept her hands wrapped around it anyway, because the warmth, even fake warmth, was something to hold on to when the rest of your life was quietly falling apart. She was 31 years old, worked double shifts at the Meridian Club on King Street West, and had exactly $412 in her checking account. She knew because she'd checked at the ATM on her way in, the way she always did before a big shift, like a sailor checking the weather before heading out to sea. Her mother's dialysis treatments had gone up again. The clinic in Etobicoke didn't negotiate, neither did the landlord. So when Henri, the head server, called in sick at 7:45 on a Tuesday night, Hazel said yes before he even finished the sentence. She didn't know what she was walking into. She never did on nights like that. The private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Meridian was called the Onyx Suite. It was the kind of room that didn't exist on the public menu. You had to know someone, or be someone, to even know the number to call. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. The table was poured concrete and polished steel, a strange, brutal thing in a room meant to suggest refinement. There were no prices on anything. There was no menu at all. The kitchen simply sent up whatever the guest had requested in advance, and the server's only job was to be invisible. Hazel had worked the Meridian for 3 years. She knew how to be invisible. She checked her reflection in the elevator doors on the way up, dark hair pinned back, white jacket pressed, posture straight. She looked like someone who belonged. That had always been her talent, looking like she belonged in rooms that would have turned her away at the door. The suite had 6 men in it when she entered. 5 of them were dressed in the particular way of men who had made their money doing something they didn't fully explain. The 6th was Julian Caruso. She recognized him before she could stop herself, which was the kind of thing that happened when a person had done 3 years of paralegal coursework before dropping out to take care of their mother. Julian Caruso's name had appeared in her business law textbook. Not in the chapter about success stories. He was younger than she'd expected, 40, maybe 42, with dark eyes and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to let other people fill the silence first. He sat at the far end of the table with a leather portfolio open in front of him, and a man to his left, older, wire-rimmed glasses, the nervous energy of someone who desperately needed to be perceived as calm, was talking at him in a low, urgent voice. Hazel moved to the sideboard. She began uncorking the wine. She kept her eyes on the bottles. The man with the glasses was named Paul. She caught that much. Paul something. Paul with the soft hands and the monogrammed cufflinks, and the way he kept patting the portfolio like he was afraid it might run away. Someone is in a hurry, she thought. Someone wants something signed tonight. The wine was a 2018 Burgundy, the kind that cost more than her month's rent. She poured without being asked, moved around the table, kept her breathing even. The men barely registered her. She was the room. She was the temperature. She reached Paul's side and leaned to fill his glass. That was when she saw it. She almost missed it. It was the kind of thing you'd miss unless you'd spent 8 months studying contract law, unless you'd sat in Professor Okafor's seminar, and listened to him say, 3 times, in 3 different ways, the most dangerous clause is always the one that sounds the most routine. It was page 6 of the portfolio, open in front of Julian Caruso. A liability transfer clause. Standard boilerplate at a glance, the font, the paragraph breaks, the heading. But Hazel had read enough documents to know when something had been assembled from pieces that didn't quite match. The indemnification language in paragraph 4 referenced a subsection that didn't exist anywhere else in the visible pages. It was a floating provision, a trap door. If he signed, and if the deal ever went sideways, if anyone filed a complaint with the OSC, if a federal audit ever came looking, every asset tied to his name would transfer automatically. Not to the company, not to a shared holding, to the counterparty, to whoever had written this document. Paul had written this document. Hazel stood very still. She looked at the wine in her hand. She looked at Julian Caruso, who was capping his pen, preparing to sign. She thought about her mother in the dialysis chair 3 times a week, watching the door. She thought about her own reflection in the elevator. She moved to Julian's side. She set down the wine. "More water, Mr. Caruso." He glanced up. He had the eyes of a man who noticed things and rarely said so. "It's full." Hazel leaned in to adjust the glass. Her shoulder was 6 inches from his ear. "Don't sign page 6, she said, barely moving her lips. The indemnification clause in paragraph 4 refers to a subsection that doesn't exist. It's a transfer trigger. Your lawyer knows. She straightened. She picked up the empty bread plate. She walked to the far side of the room. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then Julian set the pen down. "Paul," his voice was pleasant, completely pleasant. "Walk me through the indemnification language on page 6. The change in Paul's face was almost imperceptible. "Almost, it's standard. We went through this in the car, Julian." Read it aloud. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Hazel had ever heard. Paul's hand went to his water glass. His fingers shook so badly he nearly knocked it over. Across the table, the other 4 men had gone very still, the way animals go still when they sense a change in the air. "I may have brought the wrong draft," Paul said finally. His voice had lost its shape entirely. There were several versions in review, were there? Julian closed the portfolio. He did not raise his voice. "He did not need to tell me, Paul. How many versions had a subsection reference that doesn't exist?" One of the other men stood up. He was broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and introduced himself to no one in the room. His name, Hazel would learn later, was Roland Fitch, and he was the man who had paid Paul to bring that portfolio to that room tonight. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Roland said. Julian looked at him for a long moment. "Sit down, Roland." Roland did not sit down. He reached inside his jacket. Everything happened very fast after that. There was shouting. A glass shattered. Hazel dropped to the floor behind the sideboard because her body made that decision before her brain did, and she pressed herself flat against the walnut paneling and tried to remember how to breathe. A hand closed around her arm. Strong. Certain. "Get up." Julian's voice close to her ear. "Door to the left. Kitchen corridor." "Go, I can't," you whispered in my ear. His grip tightened. "You picked a side. Now move." They went through the kitchen at a dead sprint, past the line cooks and the pastry station, and a sous chef who plastered himself against the wall and stared at them with enormous eyes. Out the service door, into the concrete stairwell that smelled of bleach and old grease. 42 flights. Hazel had never run 42 flights of stairs before. She was going to now. Julian kept pace with her, one hand at her back when she stumbled on the 23rd floor, not gentle exactly, but present, which was something. By the time they burst through the ground-level fire door into the alley behind the building, her lungs were screaming and her legs were made of something softer than bone. A dark car was waiting. She didn't ask how. The driver didn't look at either of them. Julian opened the back door and she got in, because the alternative was standing alone in a Toronto alley at 11 o'clock at night, with Roland Fitch somewhere above her in a building with a gun. The car moved. Hazel pressed her back against the seat and stared at the ceiling of the vehicle and tried to remember the last time she'd made a decision she didn't regret. "You're not a server," Julian said. "Not a question. I'm a server." She looked at the passing streetlights. "I used to be a paralegal student. Used to be. My mother got sick. I left school to pay for her treatment." She paused. "I graduated from the school of carrying other people's wine." Julian watched her. She could feel it without looking at him. "You saw the subsection reference. I almost didn't. Professor Okafor at Osgood spent a whole semester on exactly that technique. Floating provisions. He called them ghosts. Language that seems to reference something real, but points to nothing, so the trigger can be defined later by whoever benefits. Paul used it on a contract 2 years ago," Julian said. "A development partner in Hamilton. Same structure, different bait. The man lost everything." He looked at the city moving to the window. "I never proved it because the subsection didn't exist. There was nothing to point to." "Exactly." He turned to look at her directly for the first time since the car had moved. "What's your name?" "Hazel Briggs." Something shifted in his expression, though she couldn't read what it was. "Hazel Briggs. You just saved my company and probably your own life, and you're going to need to understand that those two things are now connected." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means Roland Fitch saw your face." Julian's voice had gone flat and careful in the way of someone managing information. "It means you can't go home tonight, possibly not for several nights." Hazel thought about the $412 in her checking account. She thought about her cat, an enormous and deeply opinionated tabby named Biscuit, who was going to be very confused by morning. She thought about her mother's appointment on Thursday. "I have a dialysis appointment to get my mother to on Thursday," she said. Julian looked at her for a moment. "We'll handle Thursday. You don't know." "No," he said. "But I know what it costs to lose one." The city slid past them. Neither of them spoke again until the car turned north. They ended up in a house in Caledon, 90 minutes outside the city, at the end of a gravel road that the GPS did not know existed. It was cedar and glass, built into the edge of an escarpment, with the kind of purposeful design that comes from someone who understood both beauty and contingency, a safe house that didn't look like one. Inside there was heat, and a kitchen and a kettle that Julian put on without asking. He handed her tea. She sat at the kitchen island and tried to stop her hands from shaking. "Paul wasn't acting alone," Julian said, sitting across from her. His jacket was off. He looked impossibly like a man who had planned for all of this. "Roland Fitch has wanted controlling interest in Caruso Holdings for 4 years. He doesn't have the liquidity to buy in legitimately, so he's been building a legal mechanism to take it instead. The transfer trigger, yes. If I'd signed, and if he'd filed a complaint with the OSC himself, which he would have, the asset transfer would have been triggered under the clause. He'd have had grounds to claim the transfer was legally valid. By the time the courts sorted it out, he'd have moved everything offshore. Julian wrapped both hands around his mug. Paul has been his man for 2 years. I didn't see it. Did Paul seem nervous to you before tonight? Julian's eyes sharpened. 3 months ago, he had a habit of staying late to review documents. He started leaving early, because he'd already given Fitch what he needed. He was just waiting for the right moment to bring it in. Hazel curled her hands around her own mug. You said he did this before. In Hamilton, a development partner named Grant lost a manufacturing property and a 40-year pension fund in the same mechanism. Julian's jaw tightened. I always believed Grant, but I couldn't move without proof. Hazel was quiet for a moment. Mr. Caruso, what happened to the people Grant owed money to? The workers. Julian looked at her. The pension disappeared into a numbered company. The company dissolved. The people got nothing. Hazel thought about her father. He'd driven a delivery truck for 22 years for a logistics firm in Mississauga. The firm had restructured when she was 19, and her father's pension, the thing he'd built his whole retirement around, had evaporated in a legal mechanism that nobody could fully explain. He died of a heart attack at 63, still working part-time, still trying to make it add up. I know what a numbered company looks like, she said quietly. I know what happens to the people when it dissolves. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite respect, but was close to it. You have a personal reason for what you did tonight, don't you? He was quiet. Then, the Caruso name has been attached to this city's waterfront development for 40 years. My father built it. My grandfather built before him. Not always cleanly, I won't pretend otherwise. But it employed 1,400 people last quarter. 1,400 people with mortgages and kids in school and parents in care homes. He paused. Roland Fitch doesn't care about any of that. He wants the asset base. He'd sell every parcel and walk away, so we stop him. Julian raised an eyebrow. We. Hazel met his eyes. Paul has the original version of that document, not just the copy he brought tonight. He'll have the source file, the revision history, the correspondence with Fitch. If we can access that, we don't just prove the fraud in this contract, we prove the pattern, the Hamilton deal, the floating provision, the whole mechanism. She leaned forward. Is there any way to get into his office systems? I own the building his firm operates from. I have a facilities access code that predates his tenancy. That's not a warrant. No, Julian agreed. But I have a lawyer in Waterloo who specializes in whistleblower protections under the Ontario Securities Act. If we can put the documents in front of her, she can advise on how to get them into evidence without either of us going to prison for obtaining them. Hazel looked at him. You've thought about this before tonight. I've thought about Paul for 3 months. I didn't have a paralegal. There was a pull in the air between them that she didn't entirely trust, the kind of pull that emerges between people who have just been through something together and mistake adrenaline for connection. She'd read enough about that to know what it was. She picked up her tea. I need to call my mother, she said, and someone needs to feed my cat. Julian reached into his pocket and produced a phone. A clean one, a burner, not her own. The call will be safe on this. Keep it brief. Don't say where you are. My mother is 70 years old and she's been watching her show since 8 o'clock. She won't ask where I am. She'll ask if I remembered to eat. Julian almost smiled. Almost. Did you? Hazel looked at the tea. I had half a bread roll in the service corridor at 6. He stood and opened the refrigerator. He pulled out a container of leftover soup and put it on the stove without asking. And Hazel watched him do it and didn't say anything, because it was almost midnight and she was exhausted and scared. And the soup smelled like leek and potato, and something in her chest that had been clenched since 7:45 began, very slightly, to loosen. Julian had a laptop. Hazel had her memory, which turned out to be better than most filing systems. She reconstructed the clause structure from what she'd seen on page 6, and Julian pulled every document Paul had submitted to the board over the past 2 years, and by 4 in the morning they had a map of it. Not proof yet, but a shape. A pattern with a hole in it where the source documents needed to go. The files will be on a server in Paul's firm, Hazel said, circling a date on a printed timeline. But he'll have a backup somewhere physical. Lawyers like Paul always do. They don't trust the cloud with the things they're most afraid of. His office has a safe. You know what's in it? No, but the building's facilities manager does the quarterly safety inspections. He has a log of every item declared for insurance purposes. Julian pulled out his name is Gerald. He owes me a favor that predates Paul's tenancy by about a decade. Call Gerald. Gerald was not thrilled to be called at 4 in the morning. Gerald was, however, the kind of man who paid his debts, and he confirmed, after some persuasion, that Paul's safe contained among other things a portable hard drive in a red casing declared as archive materials, last logged 18 months ago. "That's it," Hazel said. "That's where the source files are." Julian looked at her. "We'd need someone to get into that office. You have a facilities code. Using it without consent during business hours is one thing. Using it at 4 in the morning is breaking and entering." Hazel thought for a moment. "Paul is going to contact Fitch tonight. He already knows the signing didn't happen. He'll be in a panic. When panicked people panic, they make mistakes. What if Paul came to the office himself tonight to move those files? And what if someone was already there?" Julian was very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that if we send Paul an anonymous message implying that someone already has access to his office, something that would scare him badly enough to come in himself, he'll open that safe, and once he opens the safe voluntarily, you're no longer breaking in. You're just a building owner who happened to be doing a security check." Julian stared at her. "That's probably inadmissible in its current form. But if Paul takes those files out of the safe himself and tries to destroy them, and if Gerald's inspection log shows what was in there, and if your lawyer in Waterloo can establish the pattern independently through the OSC filings, it becomes corroborating evidence rather than primary. You're not just a building owner who dropped out of paralegal school." "I dropped out to make my mother's appointments," Hazel said. "I didn't stop learning. The message they sent was 3 ambiguous. Terrifying if you were Paul." He arrived at his office at 5:47 in the morning. Julian's facilities code got them into the building lobby 12 minutes later. They took the stairs. Paul was in his office with the safe open, and the red hard drive on the desk when the door opened, and Julian Caruso walked in with a building access card and the expression of a man who had been patient for a very long time, and was now finished being patient. Paul tried to run. Hazel, standing in the doorway, stepped sideways, and he ran directly into her shoulder, and she shoved him back with a force that surprised both of them, and he sat down on the floor of his own office like a man who had exhausted all his options. "That drive," Hazel said, pointing, "goes to your lawyer in Waterloo." "Miriam Chen," Julian said. He was already picking it up, already bagging it in the evidence-safe envelope he had somehow thought to bring. By 9 a.m. Paul sat on the floor and looked at the ceiling. "Fitch will kill me," he said. It came out very small. "Fitch is going to be dealing with a securities fraud investigation by noon," Julian said. "He'll have other things on his mind." Miriam Chen was awake by 6:30 because Julian Caruso called her, and she had been his legal advisor for 11 years, and she had learned, in 11 years, that when Julian Caruso called at 6:30 it was important. By 9 she had the drive. By noon the Ontario Securities Commission had a preliminary filing. By 4 in the afternoon, Roland Fitch's lawyers were making urgent calls to people who were not picking up. Hazel was on a couch in Julian's downtown office with a blanket someone had found for her and a coffee that had actually been made with care, not just produced by a machine, when Julian came in and told her. "It's moving," he said. "Fitch is lawyering up. Paul has agreed to full cooperation in exchange for protection. Miriam thinks the OSC will have a freeze order on Fitch's accounts by tomorrow morning." Hazel pulled the blanket tighter. "And the Hamilton deal? Miriam is looking at it. If the mechanism matches, and it will, there may be a path to recovery for the pension." He sat down across from her. "It won't be everything. These things never are. But something." She nodded. She looked at the window. The city was doing what it always did, going on entirely without her 12 floors below. "I need to get to my mother's appointment on Thursday," she said. "I know. My driver will take you." Julian paused. "After that, Hazel, I mean this, you should go back to school. Finish the degree. Miriam has a junior associate position opening in January, and she already asked me if I knew anyone with a background in corporate fraud documentation who also had." He seemed to search for the word nerve. Hazel looked at him. "You called her about me this morning. I called her about the drive." The rest of the conversation went in an unexpected direction. He held her gaze, steady. "You have the instincts for this work, not just the law, the instincts. The ability to see what a document is trying to hide. That's not taught. You either have it or you don't. My professor used to say the same thing. Your professor was right." There was a long pause. The city hummed below them. Someone knocked on Julian's office door, and he said, "Wait a moment," and the door stayed closed. "Why does it matter to you?" Hazel asked. "Whether I finish the degree." Julian thought about it. Which was something, she realized. Not everyone thought about it. Most people answered before they'd actually considered the question. "My father used to say that the most dangerous thing a company can do is surround itself with people who only know how to say yes," he said finally. "Every person in that room last night, except you, was there because they knew how to say yes. You were there because you were cheap labor at a last-minute staffing shortage, and you were the only one in the room who knew how to say stop. Hazel looked at the blanket in her hands. I almost didn't say anything. I know. Julian was quiet for a moment. What made you? She thought about her father's pension. She thought about a number on a dissolution filing that had meant everything to her family, and nothing to the people who wrote it. She thought about Professor Okafor and his seminar on ghost clauses, and about the way Paul's hands had been shaking before the pen even came out. He was already afraid, she said. Paul, before you even touched the pen. The nervousness wasn't about the meeting, it was about what the meeting was going to cost someone else. And I've seen that face before. I grew up watching what happens after people make that decision and walk away. Julian nodded, slowly. So you didn't walk away? I couldn't. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the coffee table between them. It was a business card, clean and heavyweight, with Miriam Chen's name on it, and a phone number written in ink on the back. January, he said. If Hazel looked at the card. She looked at Julian Caruso, who had walked into a room last night as the most powerful person in it, and walked out as someone who had needed to be saved by a server with a bread plate and a memory for contract law. She thought about what it had cost her to say 3 sentences in a stranger's ear, and what those 3 sentences had set in motion, and whether she was the same person she'd been when she'd stepped into that elevator at 7:45. She wasn't. She didn't think she was supposed to be. She picked up the card. My cat's name is Biscuit, she said. If your driver is going to take me home first, he should know that there's going to be a fairly dramatic amount of yelling from behind the apartment door. Julian's expression did something she hadn't seen it do yet. It became simply warm. I'll let him know. Hazel folded the card carefully and tucked it into the pocket of her server's jacket, the white one with the Meridian Club logo, stained now with a little coffee from the sprint through the kitchen, and she thought that she would hang the jacket up when she got home, and she would probably not wear it again. 4 months later, Hazel Briggs sat in a glass-walled boardroom on the 16th floor of a Bay Street office tower, across the table from Roland Fitch's legal team, with a set of annotated financial documents in front of her and Miriam Chen's voice in her earpiece giving her one last note before they went on record. The subsection reference on page 4, Miriam said. Walk them through it slowly. Let them see it. I know, Hazel said. The lead counsel across the table looked up. He was expensive. He was prepared. He had the manner of someone accustomed to the other side of the table blinking first. Hazel did not blink. Gentlemen, she said, opening the document. Let's start on page 4. The case settled 14 weeks later. Roland Fitch's assets were frozen and transferred in part to the compensation fund for the Hamilton pension, and the mechanism he and Paul had built over 4 years was documented in an OSC report that would be taught, Miriam later told her, in 3 universities. On due day, the report was filed. A small package arrived at Hazel's desk at the firm. No card, just a very good bottle of Ontario Riesling and a note in handwriting she recognized by now, for reading the fine print. She smiled. She set the bottle on the windowsill where the afternoon light came through. She called her mother, who asked if she'd eaten lunch. She had, actually. For the first time in a long time, she had.